What's going on, everybody? It is Max Ralph alongside Johnny McGonigal. We're here for another mailbag podcast. Again, we love doing these. It's a lot of fun. Again, I'm wearing the same clothes as the one in the Bob podcast. If you're curious, we are recording this on the same day. Don't judge me. But Johnny, how we doing this morning?
Doing well, man. Doing well. We're recording this Thursday morning. I'm actually heading up to State College here in a few hours. My buddy from college, from the Daily Collegian student newspaper,
Okay,
which you are very familiar with. He's actually doing
absolutely.
he's doing his bachelor party around the Penn State whiteout game.
Okay.
So a bunch of us from the Collegian will get together tonight, hang out Friday. And then, they're going to be tailgating and I get to go cover a game. So, but very much looking forward to the whiteout as always. And, big game for Penn State coming off this Ohio State loss.
Yeah, of course. I mean, hey, at least it's a night game, so
Yeah.
you can at least hang around them a little bit through the day. I would hope, but certainly the full tailgating experience probably not a great idea before
No,
going in to cover a game.
definitely not.
This is Johnny. This is totally not something I anticipated bringing up, but and did not warn you about before we hit record. But I just gotta say, Florida put out a statement that they're retaining Billy Napier. And I'm shocked, and I think that has some small impact on Penn State.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, Florida has turned it around, relatively speaking, since a really rough start to the season. They open week one, get smacked by Miami, and then kind of go from there. They hung tough with Georgia really until the end. That 14-point deficit, the difference on the scoreboard, wasn't indicative of Georgia controlling the game.
Right.
It was tight, into the fourth quarter. So maybe that gives them a little bit more confidence than being Florida. Maybe it was a prohibitive buyout that they didn't want to pay. I know that there's some interesting athletic department dynamics that are going on down there. But interesting and pertinent you bring up that because, there was just speculation, really not even speculation, just like fans, like kind of bar talk, like, shooting the shit at the bar, being like, oh, like would James Franklin go to Florida? And, for a number of reasons, like I could see it where, Phil Troutwine, former Florida star, is your offensive line coach at Penn State. Jaywan Sider, your running backs coach, used to coach there. So there were some threads, some through lines, but with Napier being retained, it doesn't look like we're going to have to be writing those stories anytime soon, Max.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I just thought it was interesting and worth bringing up, even though it's just stirring the rumor pot a little bit. But I thought it was interesting. I guess Florida's probably looking at it where the bulk of their like star players are all young and hoping that they give it maybe a year or two to figure it out. But Billy Napier certainly was a popular hot seat candidate. Let's get into the questions. We got some good ones this week. A lot more, I think more PSU specific than we've had in the past few weeks, which is totally cool and understandable after that Ohio State loss. But big one coming this weekend. Let's start with Dan in Alaska. He specified he was from Alaska, and I said I had a little conversation with him on our subtext. And I said, well, that's a long way away, and he said, yeah, I'm the biggest Penn State fan out here. Moved out here for military and decided to stay. And I was like, I feel like you probably don't have a whole lot of competition for that. And he said, no, actually, there's quite a few Penn State fans out here. So I thought that was kind of cool. And I've been to Alaska once. It's beautiful. But yeah, anyway, Dan's question, pertinent to the whiteout this weekend. How is a top 25 matchup? Now, granted, Penn State is number 6. Washington received votes in the AP poll for this weekend. How is a top 25 matchup, a night game kicking off at 8 p.m., the whiteout, not on a normal TV network. It is on Peacock this weekend, where you have to have a subscription to get it. Is this a sign of things to come, Johnny?
I don't know if it's a sign of things to come as much as like it just is the reality of this weekend in college football. I know that Penn State, fans are not particularly pleased with it being on a streaming service.
Right.
But if I'm not mistaken, Florida State plays Notre Dame this weekend, and that normally, is like that got locked in before the season as a night game on
Mm-hmm.
NBC. Given the Notre Dame connection there to NBC, so Penn State, wasn't going to be on NBC with a night game, and then it's just a matter of what Big Noon and CBS wants to pick up, and then NBC's hanging out there and says, yeah, sure, we'll take it and just put it on Peacock. So I think it was just more of a circumstance of the weekend. I don't know if you have any more to add on that, Max. I don't see, like, the other thing too is, NBC sees it as an opportunity to maybe get more subscribers to Peacock and get people on board, paying, $5 a month or whatever it is. I'm already a subscriber because of Premier League. I have to be.
Right.
So it's not an issue for me, but I know that there are some people out there who probably didn't have Peacock before this weekend. So that might be what they're looking at as well.
Yeah, I don't really have anything else to add. I think Penn State was probably doing everything it could to make sure that CBS did not scoop this up in the 3:30 slot when it was announced that it was either going to be 3:30 or 8 p.m. I mean, at this time of year in State College, you are getting a full second half in dark if it is a 3:30 kick, but like they didn't make Ohio State the whiteout to begin with, so if it wasn't a night game, I think people were going to be pissed. So, so I think Penn State was probably putting all the pressure it could on NBC to take this game and for CBS to avoid it. But yeah, I don't know. I don't see it becoming like baseball where you get like a game a week on a streaming service necessarily, especially with a brand as big as Penn State. It might happen once a year, but like I think college football is just the type of sport with the notoriety it gets where streaming services, at least for now, are not going to take over anytime soon.
They're not going to take over, but you do see it where I think Peacock does have a game a week in the Big Ten.
Right.
But Penn State isn't going to get, back to back to back on that. Like, right. I think it's more of just an outlier of the season. And I'm sure, and understandably so, there are some fans who are upset that it's not in prime time on regular cable, the whiteout, but just kind of just happens to be what it is, given this week's schedule.
Yeah. All right. Let's head to the next one. This one comes from Brian G. Can Penn State win out and not make the playoff? There's some concerns about having a weak schedule, which is fair. I mean, outside of the Ohio State game, haven't played a currently ranked team. Illinois was ranked when they played earlier this season. So, Johnny, do you think Penn State could win out and not make the playoff?
No, I don't. Clip this if it happens, if they go 11-1 and they somehow don't get in. But you mentioned the strength of schedule, Max. Yep. They're 28th in the country by ESPN's metrics, which is pretty good. It's not top 10 or top 5 or anything, but compared to, say, Indiana, which is 103rd on ESPN's metrics, and if Indiana loses to Ohio State, I think if Indiana loses to Ohio State, they're not getting in. I don't know if it would be right or not that an 11-1 Indiana team wouldn't get in, but I don't think that they would get in. I think Penn State, though, given how closely they played Ohio State, and I know that it was really frustrating for fans to watch that unfold, but given that was a one-touchdown game, Penn State had an opportunity and blew it, but an opportunity to tie it midway through the fourth quarter, send it to overtime, or possibly win. The committee clearly cared about that. I was on a teleconference Tuesday night with the CFP chair, Ward Manuel, who's also the athletic director at Michigan. Yep. And when asked about Penn State, he brought up how quote unquote back and forth that Ohio State game was, and it was a result that could have gone the other way. And so I think the committee is really going to hold that in high regard as long as Ohio State keeps winning, because they were number 2 in the country ahead of Georgia at number 3. So bottom line, I think 11-1 gets Penn State in the field and almost guarantees a home playoff game with where they are right now at number 6, and with other losses coming for the SEC, by the way, because a lot of those teams have to match up. And there are a couple 2-loss teams out there: Ole Miss, Alabama, LSU. There's an elimination game this weekend, Alabama, LSU. So I think Penn State is pretty secure right now. And if they go 11-1, I see no scenario in which they don't get it.
Yeah, you said the exact thing that I wanted to bring up. I mean, the fact that the committee has them at number 6 right now, ahead of Indiana, following that Ohio State loss, I'd just be flabbergasted if Penn State won out and moved away from the top 12. They're there now. As long as they do what they have to do the rest of the way, they'll be in. They control their own destiny. I guess the only like doomsday way I could see it happening is if they win like every game by 1 point.
If they win every game by 1 point, and then you've got, say Ole Miss beats Georgia this weekend, and then they want to get both of those teams in. Say you have an undefeated BYU go into the Big 12 title game and then lose.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, well, we need a 12-1 BYU. Like, they deserve to be in, and then the Big 12 champion has to get in. Say you have an undefeated Miami, lose to, say, a one-loss SMU in the ACC title game, and then both, two ACC teams get in. There are doomsday scenarios out there, but I think it's like a 95% chance that they would get in at 11-1, if not higher than that.
Yeah, I'm with you. Especially, the schedule the rest of the way is pretty doable. So, all right, let's move on. This one is a little bit niche, Johnny, and might be out of our realm of expertise, but I appreciated the question from Lou Z. There are probably more intriguing questions, but what's up with Penn State's punting? He's averaging north of 40 yards a kick, but he doesn't seem to have the field position changers that we've seen with guys like Jordan Stout or Blake Gillikin in the past. Like I said, it might be out of our comfort zone here, but I do think it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I was going to say we should have brought my uncle on. He was a college punter and kicker,
okay,
so he could have given us more perspective on this. But I was not a college. I'll call in my uncle. Riley Thompson's been fine this year. There have been times though where it's like, oh, there's an opportunity for a coffin corner, pin him inside the 5, and it's like fair caught at the 11 or 12. And it's like you go back and look at the stats, and one of the stats for punters, at least in our stat books that we use, that Penn State has for games, and every college football team has for games, it's like pinned inside the 20. So Riley Thompson has a decent amount of those, but
he does.
But the person who asked the question is right. There hasn't been a lot of like game-changing field position punts so far from him this year. He's certainly no Jordan Stout or Blake Gillikin. I think Penn State had an embarrassment of riches at punter, with those two guys in close succession. So he's not either of those guys, but he hasn't killed you yet this year either.
Right. I'll give a shout out to Barney Amore too. I mean, he didn't have the leg that those guys did, but he was a master at pinning teams inside the 20, inside the 10. Yeah. I do think that Penn State used to have an inside the 10 number as well on its website that no longer is there. I could be wrong. Don't quote me on that. But yeah, Thompson's numbers are fine. He's got 9 kicks inside the 20 out of 25 punts. That's a solid percentage, especially when you consider at times the Penn State offense has sputtered and had 3 and outs in their own territory. So those numbers are fine. He's getting teams inside the 20. That's good. But his average is just 42.8 yards per kick, 69th in the country. If I remember correctly, his average was about 48 last season. So there's definitely been a drop-off. And I also remember last season, it wasn't really until the second half of the year that Thompson kind of hit his stride. At the beginning of the year, he was kicking some shorter punts, but by the end of the year, he had a bunch of 50-plus kicks. He's only got 3 so far this year. And while I can't personally analyze a punter for what he's doing right and wrong, I've never kicked before. What I will say is there has been a lot of discussion about field position for Penn State and what it has done for this team. I think it's been and this might be a hot take, but I think it's been one of the number one contributing factors to Penn State not dominating teams in the way it should. They've had terrible starting field position. I think against Ohio State, we saw Nick Singleton take a few more kicks out of the end zone than we're used to seeing, maybe in an attempt to try and boost that. They've had terrible field position. I've searched before to look for like an average starting field position website stat. Haven't found it. I'd love to, because Penn State's has been terrible this year. I think games we've seen, like they're starting inside their own 20 more times than not. That's how it feels. And kind of makes it tough for Thompson, because if they stall out in their deep in their own end like that, he's got to have a hell of a kick to flip the field. But you can also make the argument, well, you need to have those every now and then, and they're not getting them.
Just one other thing to add. Correct me if I'm wrong, Max. I don't think there have been any explosive punt returns that Penn State has allowed this year.
Correct.
So that's another thing where it's like, yeah, he might not be pinning you inside the 5, but he's also not out kicking his coverage. Penn State's been pretty solid when it comes to that. Still 4 games to go, but through 8 games so far this season, to not allow not even just a touchdown, but like a 30-yard return or 40-yard return. There might be, someone might email us and be like, oh, you guys forgot about the one return that Kent State had in the 4th quarter. But I think for the most part, they've been pretty good there. So, it's a balance.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I'm again off the top of my head, but I think Wisconsin returned a punt for like 7-ish yards. And that was actually the first punt return yardage Penn State had allowed all season. So definitely a balance. And, new special teams coordinator, maybe what Justin Lustig is asking for is a higher kick that allows less returns. And so far, that has been the case. It's worked for him. So, I don't know. It's kind of a weird situation with Riley Thompson. I will say, though, Penn State definitely likes him. He was just made available to the media last night. I don't see any changes coming there by any means. But yeah, it's something to keep an eye on. So thanks for the question, Lou. I hope we answered it. We've got kind of an in-depth one here from Jeff High, who's a frequent asker here. We appreciate that. And he says, hey, Max, every year Penn State seems to make a shoddy Ohio State position group suddenly look like a group of All-Americans. This year it was the O-line. Ohio State's offensive line was a patchwork mess going into last Saturday's game. Came out of the game looking like a group of seasoned veterans. Penn State's O-line has been a mess the entire Franklin era. When, if ever, will Franklin and his coaching staff be able to put together a good O-line? Now, Johnny, that's a lot to take in, but I know that I think we've got a lot of thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'll start with the bit about Ohio State's offensive line looking really good against Penn State. I think in the run game late, obviously with that closing drive that they had 10 straight runs to bleed the clock out after Penn State failed from multiple goal-to-go situations. Not what you want to see from Penn State's defense, and certainly a confidence booster and something to build on for Ohio State's offensive line. That they were able to move the guys around enough to create space for Judkins, Henderson, and even Will Howard to just keep the ball on the ground and bleed the clock out. I also think that Penn State's pass rush actually did pretty well. There were times where Will Howard, and I think it was more of a schematic thing where, they're putting them in conflict with the fake tosses and everything else. Chip Kelly did a really good job of toying with Penn State's defense a little bit. But we saw Abdul Carter have a couple of big sacks on 3rd down. I think Penn State had 3 total sacks on Will Howard, 7 quarterback hurries, and 13 pressures overall. So I think it was actually pretty good, especially when you didn't have Dennis Sutton. Like, Denai was out there for a couple of plays, but when you don't have a first-round guy opposite your other first-round guy at defensive end, you're going to see a little bit of a drop-off. Also, credit to Donovan Jackson, Ohio State's guard, who flipped out to left tackle because they did lose their starting left tackle, first-round guy, and Josh Simmons in the Oregon game. Zen Michalowski, I think his name is Mikulski. Mikulski filled in for him in the Nebraska game, got hurt, was kind of iffy going into the Penn State game. They flipped Donovan Jackson out. And aside from giving up a couple of those sacks to Abdul Carter, I thought he actually played pretty well. So, yeah, I mean, I get the genesis of the question because we did talk a lot about Ohio State's offensive line going into that game as being a weakness. That's where I thought that Penn State would ultimately win the game and win the day with that matchup. But yeah, I don't think it was as lopsided or as stunning as maybe some people thought ultimately.
Yeah, I'll tackle the second half of that question with Penn State's offensive line, but just to add a quick note on what you said, Johnny. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Donovan Jackson. Like, to say they looked like a seasoned group of vets coming out of it, well, that's because they were. I mean, Donovan Jackson is a veteran, experienced guard who was just playing out of position a little bit, which led to some of those pressures from the Penn State defensive line. Again, I agree with you. I think Abdul Carter had a good game. I thought that he was impactful. I thought the pass rush in general was pretty solid. But when you look at that last drive, Donovan Jackson, if you're asking him to sit there, put his hand in the ground and run block the whole time, it's really not that much different than playing guard. So like, I think if you compartmentalize it to the pass rush against a guy playing out of position who has played a lot of football, I think Penn State did pretty well. Yes, the run game picked up late. Those are the two best running backs in the country. Best running back duo in the country, let me say. Best running back duo in the country. And they got a chance to just lean on the Penn State defense. And one other thing with that drive, Penn State didn't play any reserve linebackers in that game. It was only Kobe King, Tony Rojas, and Dom DeLuca. They didn't have fresh legs. They were just getting pounded all day. So I think that's kind of where that last drive comes from. But to say Penn State's defensive line made Ohio State's offensive line look like All-Americans, I disagree a little bit. The second half, Penn State's offensive line, I think it's a misguided take to say that Penn State hasn't had a good offensive line since James Franklin took over. I do agree that if you give better offensive lines to the 2016, 2017 teams, Saquon Barkley is winning the Heisman. I mean, like, he was damn close as it was, but he didn't have the greatest offensive line. And even still, that 2017 offensive line was the best that Penn State had in a long time, until I would say Phil Trautwein has kind of gotten in his groove. I think that the past 3 years, really, Penn State has put offensive lines out there that are good. You know, you could say 2021, that year, they went 7-6. They didn't have a good offensive line. They gave up a ton of sacks. But I remember, don't have the numbers straight off the top of my head, but they gave up, I want to say, like 30-something sacks in 2021, and it was only 12 in 2022. You get Olu stepping in. Even after Olu got hurt, Drew Shelton great at left tackle. They figured it out. They've had Juice Scruggs to Hunter Norzad to Nick Dawkins at center. They've got a great line there. Right tackle, you look at Caden Wallace, was pretty bad in 2022, even when they had an improved offensive line. He was phenomenal last year and earned himself, a 4th-round pick out of New England, and he's been their starter at right tackle. Like, Phil Trautwein has developed guys. He's put together good offensive lines. I think this year's group has done a nice job. I think that they're a little bit of a different looking offensive line. Outside of Venga Ioane and Sal Wormley, they're a little bit on the smaller side, a little more athletic, but I think that's worked well with what Andy Kotelnicki likes to do with a lot of zone runs and everything. I think it's a good group. I think Phil Trautwein does a really nice job on the recruiting trail. You can look at his numbers over the past couple of years. Yeah, sure, there have been a couple of guys so far. You look at Javen Williams and Alex Birchmeyer, who were really highly rated recruits that haven't made impact on the field yet. They still got a chance, absolutely. They haven't done it yet, maybe a disappointment for some people. But to say that that Penn State hasn't had a good offensive line since James Franklin took over, I think that's misguided.
Yeah, I guess also what the definition of a good offensive line is. Like, if you want it to be a dominant top 5, like Joe Moore Award contending unit, then if that's your definition of good,
right,
then fair enough. But they have had talent on that offensive line.
Sure.
I think at times this year, they have, asserted their dominance with, their physicality. Look back at the Illinois game. I think if you look at the numbers, I think they're 51st in the country in run blocking grade, by Pro Football Focus. And then the easiest thing to look at in terms of pass blocking is sacks allowed. And they've only allowed 9 sacks this year, which is 15th in the FBS, 15th best. So it's been solid, but also I understand the frustrations when Katron Allen gets the ball 3 times in a row, from 3 yards and 2 yards and a yard in, and he's not able to cash it. Like a part of that is on Katron, a part of that is on the predictability of the play calling going back to back to back, but also a big part of it is not the guys up front not being people movers in those moments. So when that's your last impression of what this offensive line is, I understand. I understand the question or the frustration around that group. But I think for the most part, when you look at it on the whole, I think it's been solid this year. It hasn't been like overwhelmingly amazing, but it's been solid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it was better last year. Excuse me. I think the offensive line as a whole was better last year. But I don't think I'd go as I'd still say this is a good group this year. I think that they've got some growing to do for sure. Look at a guy like Cooper Cousins for next year, maybe at that center spot in Nick Dawkins' place. But yeah, I think it's a good group. No, it's not. It's not one of the best in the nation necessarily, but I think it's solid. Having a hard time here. Excuse me, but we got one more to send this out, Johnny. This question comes from Greg W. It says, is the visceral Ohio State outcome potentially the galvanizing wake-up call this team and James Franklin needed, coming against a genuine top 3 team, providing a playoff springboard to reset and prove to themselves that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, regardless of 5-star count? So I guess in my own words, Johnny, does this push them in the right direction?
First of all, that was very poetic. That was a poetic question. Dropping visceral in there. Yeah. I love it.
Give Greg some props.
I'm not poking fun. I love it. As a writer, you got to appreciate it. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Like, I get it. You know, if you came out of that game and you were just extremely annoyed and pissed off and angry that they lost, I get it. If you want to look at it and say, hey, you know, Penn State, like they went to overtime against a USC team that is now not looking great. Like, you know, they didn't blow out Illinois, even though I thought game control wise, there was never a doubt that they were going to win that game. You know, they were down at half against Bowling Green. You know, if you want to look at that and say, hey, this was the first like real, you know, test for this team, and they lost by a touchdown, had an opportunity to win at the end, and now they can springboard it and, you know, play inferior competition to Ohio State and finish 11-1, springboard it, all that. Yeah, I'm cool with that too. I get that too. I mean, I think we'll find out Saturday. What this team is kind of made of, and the whiteout atmosphere helps, you know, significantly. But you know, this Washington team isn't going to come in and just let them win. You know, they have some talent. I don't think as much talent nearly as Penn State, and we both picked Penn State to win comfortably. But I think we'll find out Saturday what this team is about, because if they come out slow and it's dicey at halftime, or you know, if it's dicey in the fourth quarter, then 11-1 isn't looking as promising. But you know, I do think there's enough leaders on this team. I think there's enough leaders on this team and enough guys who have been through it. Like Sal Wormley is a 6-year guy. Like Nick Dawkins has been around for a while. Jalen Reed has been around for a while. You can go down the list. I think there's enough guys who know how to deal with a loss, which is not where you want to be ultimately, that you know how to deal with losing to Ohio State. But I think there's enough guys who know how to deal with the loss, compartmentalize it, and keep the bigger picture at play, which is at this point, you know, getting into the 12-team playoff and competing for a national championship.
Yeah, I'll start with the first half of what you were saying, Johnny, and I you know, the strength of schedule, the tests they've had along the way. I attribute the Bowling Green thing to Bowling Green is as good of a MAC team as you're going to get. It's early in the season. They're playing the prove it ball. So, you know, the higher ranked team, Penn State, still early in the season for them too, trying to figure some stuff out. Bowling Green's playing on their A game. You know, I don't put a ton of stock in what that game was. Yeah, it was too close. Shouldn't have been like that. But that's a good Bowling Green team. They did it again against Texas A&M. Like, you gotta give that some credit. I think the Illinois game, people might box score watch and feel a little bit more worried than they should. Penn State dominated that game, plain and simple. Illinois offense went nowhere. And then the USC game, I recall saying this, I think, on a podcast with you, that I predicted that Trojans team is going to go lose some more games after the Penn State loss because they
Yeah.
were only 2 losses. They were looking to save their season there at home. That is a talented USC team. I don't care what their record is at the end of the year. They have talent on that sideline. Absolutely. At really every level. They got a great safety. They had a good quarterback. I think he lost some of his confidence here. Got a great running back, great group of receivers. Penn State had to battle to win that game for good reason. Talented team playing at home with basically their season on the line because once you hit 3 losses, you're cooked. Um, and yes, they've lost since then, but I don't think the final record is indicative of what Penn State had to go up against USC. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, to get back to the main point, I do think Penn State was already tested this season. I think that they've already proven it. I think you and I talked about the leadership thing on another podcast as well, and I think that that was kind of a pleasant surprise for this Penn State group. I was kind of worried in the preseason about what their leadership would look like, and they've had some guys really step up. You didn't even mention Devon J. Thomas, who I think is one of the most vocal guys, despite not being a team captain this year. So yeah, to say this galvanizes them is difficult because I'm not sure. I guess the reason why I don't know if it necessarily galvanizes them is because I don't know if they need galvanized. Like, I think that they were right there in that Ohio State game. I genuinely I still think like that's a couple of plays away from being a win. Like, I don't know that they need galvanized. I think that they've talked a ton about flushing the loss, which, we'll see on Saturday if they did that. But I think this is one of the best teams of the James Franklin era at Penn State. Like, I'll say that. That might be a hot take, but I think it's true. I think as far as talent goes, I think this is one of the better teams that he's put out there. And I'm not sure that they need galvanized. Do I think that they come back from this loss in a good way? Sure. I'm not sure they need galvanized.
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't hate the take at all. I think it's totally fair. Like you mentioned, tested already. Tested already this season, and if anything, if maybe not galvanizing, but encouraged. Like it's I hate the moral victory thing,
Yeah.
and when you're that close to winning and you've
Right.
lost that many times to that team and that program, like I don't think there's any
Mm-hmm.
moral victories here. So that's not what I'm saying. But when you are that close as a team, I guess it's a person by person basis, a player by player basis. You can look at it and be upset about it, or you can look at it and say we were that close, like we want to play them again. And there were guys after the game who were talking about a potential rematch against Ohio State. Like they wanted to play Ohio State again, whether that's somehow getting into the Big Ten title game, which doesn't look likely, or possibly playing them in the playoff, which could very well happen.
Yeah.
It's like to come out and have that kind of like right after the game, be like, I want that team again. Like we messed up this shot and we want it again later in the
Mm-hmm.
year. I think does show confidence already. So
Yeah.
I don't. Yeah, I'm interested to see how they come out and play this weekend. I think that'll be telling. But I think there's enough guys in that locker room that they know that they're one of the best teams, not only in the James Franklin era, but one of the best teams in the country. Like certainly
Yeah.
one of the best 10 teams in the country, and a
Mm-hmm.
playoff worthy team that is going to more likely than not have a chance to win a couple games, make a run, and do some damage.
Yeah. No, you brought up the exact final thing I wanted to say about it was the fact that the guys said they want to play Ohio State again. You don't say that unless you know that you're good enough to beat them and you know that you're good enough to maybe give yourself that chance. Like, I think if you want to say galvanized, sure, I think they are. Like you said, I'm not sure they needed to be, but I think they are. I think they're pissed off. I think they're gonna cruise to the finish line, and I would love to see another chance against Ohio State. I'm not saying they win if they get that second chance. If it's at a neutral site versus, Ohio Stadium, maybe a better chance. But like, I'm not saying they're going to win it, but I would love to see it just because I think that those two teams are very evenly matched this year. I think that Penn State, the final part of that question from Greg was a team being greater than the sum of its parts, or however you put it. I think you've got that with Penn State. I think that there's a lot of talent, but I do think that the leadership is a big deal. I don't know. I like the way that they're going to run to the finish line. They could lose in that first round of the playoff, but they're going to make it, in my opinion. We'll see. We'll see. I think it's a good team. There's a lot of football left. The season doesn't end with that loss to Ohio State. Is kind of the bottom line. I could go on and on about it, but I think it's a good team. I think they're ready for the home stretch. Johnny, anything you want to add here before we send it out?
I just have one question now. Listeners of this podcast won't be able to see what's over your left shoulder, but those on YouTube watching will see. Is that Gengar?
It is Gengar. Johnny, I'm glad you asked because I'm shocked. Bob has not brought up my podcast background to this point in a podcast with him because that just seems like a very Bob thing to do. But this is my wall of travel stuff basically. So up there, like this thing, and up there are pieces that I bought when I traveled to Japan. I got this in New Zealand for covering the Women's World Cup. That's from Japan. The plate is from Japan. But like the Gengar, I am a rewards member at a local video game store, like GameStop, but smaller. And they were giving out freebies for like being a rewards member at the beginning of the month. They were giving out these little, it's like a little coin purse that's also a stuffed animal. And I'm planning on going back to Japan in March, and they use cash and coins a ton over there. So the thing's going to come in handy. But yeah, it is Gengar. I had my choice between Snorlax and Gengar, and I went with Gengar. I don't know. Maybe a hot take. Both were good chances, but I am positive that however many people watch this podcast are also huge Pokemon fans like me. So, and yes, that was a hell of a lot of sarcasm.
I was going to say, you said that you're surprised Bob hasn't brought it up. There's no way Bob knows what Gengar is.
Which is why I think that he would have brought it up, because I think he'd say, what the hell is that, Max?
Yeah. That's funny. Well, funny you bring up your background. So I just moved into, didn't just move into my new place in Philly, but I got here like a couple months ago.
Right.
And finally, I've been recording from like a dining room table this whole time.
Yeah.
With just a generic background. I finally got my office all set up. Just have to hang all my soccer scarves from all the games I've been to.
There we go.
So next week, you'll be seeing a new background, PennLive on YouTube. So look forward to that because that's definitely what's most important, not the insight and opinions we give on Penn State football.
They come to this podcast to get to know us, Johnny. Let's be real. Awesome. You want to throw your score prediction in there quick, since you didn't get to do it on the podcast with Bob and I.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, 31-13 Penn State.
Yeah.
I just think this team is better.
I agree.
Washington's pass defense is ranked number 2 in the country, and yes, they are good schematically there, but I think it's also a byproduct of who they've played. Mm-hmm. Iowa, Rutgers. They don't really have much interest in throwing the ball. They played Indiana when Curtis Rourke was out. So with a backup quarterback, I think they were more inclined to run the ball. And so I think it's a good pass defense. But what I'm saying is I think it's a gettable run defense. And I think for a few weeks now, Katron Allen and Nick Singleton have not popped. Mm-hmm. And I think they're both going to pop this weekend in the whiteout. A turnover or two on defense makes this one pretty comfortable.
Yep, I think Andy Kotelnicki is playing with an attitude this weekend. So curious to see it. I went 38-17. We're kind of in the same boat where we think this one's going to not be very close. But thanks for listening, guys. We will continue to do these mailbag pods. As we always say, Johnny and I get a kick out of them. Gengar says thanks as well. And we'll see you next time.